The morning started with the buzzer snarling like it had a hangover. I hit the release, half expecting a delivery boy. Instead, the phone jumped to life, insistent as a tax collector. I caught it on the first ring. "Wolfe's office," I said. "Talk fast." The voice on the line cracked with terror. "She's dead. My cousin is dead. Mirrors, glass were everywhere." Before I could get a word in, the office door banged open so hard Fritz nearly dropped a tray. A young woman in a rain-soaked silver dress stumbled in, clutching a blood-stained scarf. Her eyes were wide, wild. "They'll blame me," she gasped. "But it wasn't me. You have to believe me. She was my cousin, the heiress. She was to sign the testament tonight. Now she's lying in shards of glass." From behind me, Wolfe stirred. For him, it was like a sprint. His massive frame shifted, and his eyes opened with weight. "Identify yourself." "Clarissa Vale," she whispered. "My cousin, Eleanor, the mirror heiress. They called her that because of her collection. She had mirrors from every century. She was found in front of her Venetian glass, cut to ribbons." Sirens wailed outside, closing in fast. Clarissa thrust the scarf into my hands. Dark smears of crimson streaked its fabric, but the pattern of the stains was too precise. Not random. Wiped. I glanced at Wolfe. His voice was heavy, commanding. "Archie, we go. If Inspector Kramer arrives before us, the truth will be trampled." That got me moving. I grabbed my coat, her arm, and hustled her to the street. We flagged a cab, barreling uptown toward the Vale mansion. Clarissa shook with every turn of the wheels. "She was about to change her will," she blurted. "I was the only one who knew. She told me she would cut Harold, the trustee, out completely. He'll say I killed her to get it, but he was the one who'd lose everything." When we pulled up, the mansion blazed with lights. Neighbors clustered on the steps. Inside, the air was thick with perfume and smoke. And in the great hall, beneath the shattered sprawl of a Venetian mirror taller than a man, Eleanor Vale lay broken. Blood traced cruel lines across the reflective shards. Her eyes stared upward, unseeing, as if the glass had stolen her soul. A man stood over her, rigid as a statue, fists clenched. Harold Vale, the cousin trustee. His face was pale, his suit immaculate, except for the flecks of glass on his cuffs. He looked up when we entered. His voice was cold. "So, she called you, of course. Perfect timing. Now you can help Clarissa spin her lies." Clarissa recoiled, but I stepped forward. "Save the speeches, Harold. You've got glass in your sleeves and motive in your pockets." Before he could answer, a uniformed officer rushed in from the corridor. "Inspector, another body. Downstairs in the conservatory. The butler. Throat cut." The room froze. Clarissa gasped, clutching my arm. Harold's eyes widened, for just a flicker, then hardened. The sirens outside wailed louder, then cut off as brakes screeched. Blue lights flashed through the stained glass windows. Inspector Kramer was about to storm in, and if he saw Clarissa standing here with blood on her scarf, she wouldn't walk out free. One heiress died in shards of glass. A second corpse is already waiting, and a testament no one wanted signed. Hell of a way to start the evening. The sound of boots on marble was like thunder rolling through the Vale mansion. Inspector Kramer barged in with his men, his cigar already chewing up the air. He took one look at Eleanor Vale's broken body, the shattered mirror glittering around her like a cruel crown, and then his eyes locked on me as if I'd been waiting with a hammer in my hand. "Goodwin," he growled. "Every time. Why is it you're always first on the scene?" "Lucky timing," I said. "Or unlucky, depending on which end of the glass you're on." Kramer swung to Clarissa, who was pale as parchment, clutching the blood-streaked scarf like it was a noose she couldn't put down. "And who's this?" he barked. "She's the client," I said, "and unless you want to embarrass yourself again, you might want to slow down before slapping cuffs on her." Clarissa's voice cracked. "I didn't kill her. She was my cousin. She wanted me to inherit, but Harold—" She broke off, her eyes darting to Harold Vale, who stood rigid and silent. Kramer's cigar flared as he jabbed a finger at her. "So the heiress dies, you inherit, and you walk in with blood on your scarf. That's motive, means, and evidence in one neat package." "Too neat," I cut. "This whole setup's gift-wrapped for you, Inspector. Too bad it reeks of staging." Before Kramer could spit a reply, one of his men rushed up from the conservatory. His voice was tight. "Inspector, the butler's dead. Throat cut. Knife left behind, clean handle, no prints. Looks like it was planted." The room bristled with murmurs. Clarissa gasped again, shaking her head. Harold Vale turned, his expression grim but controlled, like a man playing to the gallery. "See?" he said. "Two bodies, both convenient for Clarissa. She despised Eleanor, and the butler would have testified against her. You'd be blind not to see it." "Blind is right," I muttered. "You've got glass on your cuffs, Harold. You expect me to believe you just tripped into the mirror while your cousin bled out?" His jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Kramer growled. "We'll sort this out at headquarters. Goodwin, you're staying put. I don't care what fairy tale Wolfe spins later." I bristled. "Fairy tale? Try fact, Inspector. Wolfe already knows that's not how it looks. He'll have your killer unwrapped before you finish your cigar." Kramer sneered, but something flickered in his eyes. Wolfe's deductions had burned him too many times to dismiss the claim outright. Still, he wasn't ready to give ground. He gestured to one of his men. "Bag the scarf. Get photos, and keep Miss Rowan where I can see her." Clarissa looked ready to collapse, her eyes darting wildly, as though every shadow in the hall accused her. I leaned close and whispered, "Hold your nerve. Wolfe doesn't let his clients swing, not while I'm still standing." Just then, another voice rang out. Sharper, colder than the rest. A maid had stepped forward, wringing her hands. "Inspector, I saw Miss Rowan in the conservatory earlier tonight, with Mr. Caldwell, the butler. They were arguing." Clarissa gasped, shaking her head violently. "That's not true. I was never there." The maid's voice rose over hers. She threatened him, said he knew too much. The whispers grew louder. Kramer's eyes gleamed. Well, well, looks like our client here's not just unlucky. She's lying." I stepped forward, voice sharp. "Hold it! You didn't mention this earlier. Why now?" The maid faltered, eyes dropping. "I was frightened. Or coached," I shot back. "Convenient that you waited until she had no defense." Kramer snapped. "Enough, Goodwin. You're not running this show." But I saw what he didn't. Harold Vale's hand twitched, the corner of his mouth curling almost imperceptibly as the maid spoke. He was enjoying this. Too much for an innocent man. I caught Clarissa's gaze again. Her eyes were wide with panic, but beneath it I saw something else. Defiance, the stubborn refusal to crumble. She whispered, almost too soft to hear, "They want me gone. They'll make me the villain." "Not if Wolfe has anything to say about it," I murmured back. At that moment, the hall phone rang, loud, shrill, cutting through the tension. Kramer motioned, and one of his men answered. He turned, holding the receiver. "It's for Goodwin." I took it, bracing. Wolfe's voice rolled through, calm, deliberate. "Archie, inform Inspector Kramer that he is making the same error he has made countless times. He is permitting appearances to blind him. The scarf was wiped, the knife was planted. And the maid, she is no witness. She is a tool." I repeated it, word for word. Kramer's face darkened, cigar nearly snapping between his teeth. "Tell Wolfe he's welcome to come down here and prove it in person instead of sending riddles by phone." Wolfe's voice rumbled in my ear. "I do not move, Inspector, but you will bring them to me. All of them. Tonight. The testament is the heart of this, not the mirrors, not the butler, not the scarf. The testament." The line clicked dead. I lowered the receiver and looked at Kramer. "You heard the man. The will's the key. Get your suspects ready for a field trip. Kramer cursed under his breath. But the doubt was there now, gnawing at him. He jabbed his cigar toward Clarissa. She's not cleared yet. But if Wolfe wants the whole gallery, he'll get it. And if he's wrong, Goodwin, I'll hang the blame on you. Fine by me, I said, because Wolfe doesn't miss. The hook tightened again. One heiress dead in a glass, one butler silenced, one scarf planted, one maid lying. And Wolfe, already pulling strings from his chair, was about to snap the trap shut. The Vale mansion became a pen of whispers and suspicion. Kramer had posted his men at every door, and the rest of us, suspects, witnesses, and one overworked detective's assistant, were corralled into the drawing room. The shattered glass from Eleanor's Venetian mirror still glinted down the hall, a reminder that her fortune had been splintered alongside her body. Clarissa sat rigid on the edge of a chair, eyes fixed on the floor as though afraid to look up. Harold Vale leaned against the mantel, calm in a way only a guilty man could manage. The maid who'd accused Clarissa hovered nearby, wringing her hands theatrically every time an officer looked her way. Kramer lit a fresh cigar, pacing in front of me like a prosecutor who'd already decided on the verdict. "Goodwin," he barked, "I've had it with your smirks and Wolfe's riddles. You're not walking out of here until I know why your fingerprints were found on that broken frame in the gallery." It hit like a sucker punch. My prints? That's impossible. I never touched that mirror frame. "Tell that to my lab boys," Kramer snapped. "They lifted them clear. Same as yours." The room bristled. Clarissa gasped, clutching her scarf tighter. Harold's smirk deepened. The maid whispered something to one of the officers, feeding the flames. I kept my voice even. "Inspector, if someone's planting evidence, they're moving faster than you can keep up. Those prints were laid there deliberately." I didn't touch that frame any more than Clarissa slit her cousin's throat. Kramer jabbed the cigar toward me. "Funny how every time evidence shows up, it points to either you or your client. If Wolfe wants to play games from his chair, fine, but you're the one in this room, and I'll book you before sunrise if you don't start talking." "Book me," I said evenly, "and you'll look like a fool in the morning. Wolfe will have the killer unwrapped while you're still trying to get the ink dry on the report." Kramer's face reddened, but before he could answer, the phone rang again. An officer picked it up, listened, and handed it to me. Wolfe's voice rolled through, calm and implacable. "Archie, tell Inspector Kramer that he is chasing shadows. Fingerprints, like scarves and knives, are all planted. And tell him this: if he continues to rely on the obvious, someone else will die before dawn." I repeated it. Kramer swore under his breath but didn't stop pacing. Wolfe continued, his tone like stone. "The will, Archie. Press them. The testament was to be signed tonight. Who stood to gain? Who feared to lose?" The line clicked dead again. I looked at the room. "You heard him. This isn't about mirrors or scarves. It's about the testament." That word landed like a stone in water. Harold Vale stiffened. Clarissa paled even further. The maid froze mid-fidget. Kramer swung to Harold. "The will? What's in it?" Harold sneered. "Ask the lawyer, Eleanor's counsel. He knows." The lawyer, a thin man with spectacles that slid constantly down his nose, spoke up reluctantly. The New Testament was to disinherit Harold almost entirely. Eleanor meant to leave the majority to Clarissa, citing her loyalty and care. Gasps rippled through the room. Harold's face flushed crimson. "A lie! That witch would have ruined everything I built." "There it is," I said. "Motive carved in glass. You lose everything, Harold, and Eleanor ends up dead under a mirror taller than you are." Harold turned on me, voice sharp. "Convenient you're so quick to point at me, Goodwin, when it's your prints turning up where they shouldn't." Before I could retort, one of Kramer's men burst in, out of breath. "Inspector, the greenhouse out back. Someone smashed the lock. Papers burned inside. Looks like fragments of a will." That set the room buzzing again. Another revelation, another hook. Clarissa sprang to her feet, crying out, "That's it!" "That's Eleanor's testament. She said she would sign tonight. If it's destroyed, then Harold—" Harold cut her off, his voice booming. She was unstable. She made threats she never meant to keep. And if she did burn the papers, then she realized her mistake before it was too late. "Or you burned them," I shot back. Kramer's gaze darted between us, cigar ash scattering like sparks. "Enough. Everyone stays put. Goodwin, you're still under suspicion. If another body turns up, you won't just be a suspect. You'll be in irons." The room fell silent. Outside, the rain lashed against the windows like a drumbeat. I caught Clarissa's eye. She looked ready to collapse, but there was fire in her expression too, a refusal to bow completely to the weight pressing down. I leaned back, forcing a grin. "Don't worry, Inspector. Wolfe's already got your killer boxed in. He's just waiting for them to twitch." Harold muttered under his breath, fists clenched. The maid shrank back into the corner, but her eyes glittered with something more than fear, and the lawyer, thin and sweating, kept fiddling with his papers as though afraid the walls themselves might accuse him. The pressure was building, tight as a drum. Wolfe had promised the killer would strike again if we missed the truth. Looking around that room, I knew he was right, and I knew the next strike was coming for someone close. The drawing room of the Vale Mansion had become an oven of suspicion. Every face was tight, every breath shallow, as if the walls themselves were closing in. Kramer, proud like a bear, puffing furiously on his cigar, while his men hovered by the doors, waiting for Wolfe's remote thunder to strike again. Clarissa sat with her hands twisted together in her lap, her pale knuckles showing the fight to keep her composure. Harold stood stiff-backed, his jaw tight with indignation, though his eyes flickered whenever the testament was mentioned. The maid shrank in her corner, too eager with her lies to convince anyone who was paying attention. That was when the phone rang again. Every head turned as if the sound had come from a gallows bell. I picked it up. Wolfe's voice rolled through, deep and deliberate. "Archie," he said, "inform Inspector Kramer that the time for fumbling has passed. He will gather them all, every principal, no exceptions, and place them in one room. Now." I repeated it word for word. Kramer scowled but motioned his men to herd everyone together. The lawyer was fetched from the study, still clutching his sweating handkerchief. 2 board members were pulled from the corridor where they had been muttering excuses. In 10 minutes, the drawing room was thick with bodies and fear. Wolfe's voice came again, commanding through the receiver I held up so all could hear. "Ladies and gentlemen, you are here because truth resists concealment. Tonight, Eleanor Vale was murdered. Caldwell, the butler, was silenced, a testament destroyed, and lies spread like vermilion ink across a page. The guilty thought to frame Clarissa Rowan, to distract with mirrors and glass. But the patterns of deceit betray themselves." The room grew hushed. Kramer glared at the phone as though he might bite through it, but he said nothing. Wolfe pressed on. "Consider the scarf," Wolfe said. "Its stains were wiped, not absorbed. Planted, not worn in violence. Consider the knife, abandoned too neatly, its handle clean of prints. Consider the fingerprints upon the frame, implanted to point toward Archie Goodwin, a clumsy attempt at misdirection." Murmurs rippled, growing louder as Wolfe continued. "Now, consider the testament. Eleanor Vale intended to disinherit Harold. That much is fact. Harold's rage is clear, but Harold is not subtle. His hands clench, his voice bellows. But this plot required subtlety, layered deceptions, planted evidence, coached servants. Harold lacks the patience." Harold exploded, shouting, "You can't accuse me and then call me too stupid in the same breath." "Silence," Wolfe thundered, the word cutting through the receiver like steel. "Your protestation confirms my observation. You were a tool, not the architect." The lawyer adjusted his spectacles nervously. "If not Harold, then who? Eleanor had no enemies outside the family. Wolfe's voice grew colder. The enemies of inheritance are not always blood. They are those closest to the will itself. A lawyer who drafts it. A maid who carries tales. Each stood to gain from Clarissa's ruin. Each had an opportunity. The maid gasped, trembling. "No, I only told what I saw." "What you were told to say," Wolfe corrected. "You are a servant, not a schemer. The words were not yours. They were supplied." He paused, letting the silence build until the room itself seemed to lean forward. "Mr. Dreslow, the lawyer," Wolfe said finally, his tone as sharp as a knife, "you are the guilty hand. You drafted Eleanor's testament, you alone knew its contents, and you alone feared the loss of Harold's patronage if she disinherited him. So you burned the new document and crafted false evidence to turn suspicion upon Clarissa. Caldwell, the butler, learned of your theft and threatened to expose you. For that, you slit his throat." Dreslow's face went waxy. His hands shook as he tried to speak. That's outrageous. You have no proof." But Wolfe pressed on, relentless. "Proof lies in your haste. The fragment of the testament found in the greenhouse bore your handwriting on its margin, a note of witness. Why would a witness burn the very document he was meant to safeguard, unless it condemned him? You were careless in your panic, Dreslow, and now the ink betrays you." Gasps filled the room. Clarissa covered her mouth. Harold staggered back a step, his composure cracking. Kramer stepped forward, eyes narrowing on Dreslow. "Is that true? Answer me." Dreslow stammered, sweat rolling down his temple. "I only meant to protect Harold. He promised me." "Promised you wealth," Wolfe said. "Promised you standing, and when Eleanor sought to cut him off, you saw your position crumbling, so you acted. You built a scaffold of mirrors and lies, and now it collapses." Dreslow's knees buckled. He sank into a chair, burying his face in his hands. His voice was muffled but unmistakable. "I couldn't let her take it all away. I couldn't." Kramer threw the cuffs on his wrists. "You're finished, Dreslow. You'll rot for this." The room broke into noise. Clarissa weeping, Harold shouting his innocence, the maid babbling her confusion. Kramer barked orders, his men dragging Dreslow to his feet. Wolfe's voice came again, calm and final. "Inspector, you have your man. The testament was the heart, not the mirrors. The butler died for knowledge, the heiress for her defiance, and the lawyer, Dreslow, for his greed. Killed them both. The matter is concluded." I lowered the receiver slowly, the weight of Wolfe's words filling the room. The trap had been sprung, the architect unmasked. Dreslow slumped in irons, the others shaken but freed from suspicion. Kramer exhaled smoke like a dragon, glaring at the phone. "Damn you, Wolfe, you did it again." I couldn't help but grin. "And you love him for it." "Shut up, Goodwin," Kramer snapped, but the edge of a reluctant smile tugged at his mouth as he hauled Dreslow out. The drawing room emptied, leaving only silence, broken glass, and the lingering echo of Wolfe's voice. Another night, another case closed from the comfort of a chair. The Vale mansion was quieter once Kramer and his men had gone, taking Dreslow in irons with them, but it wasn't a peaceful quiet. It was the kind that hums with exhaustion, the kind that follows a storm but leaves the air thick with the smell of lightning. Broken glass still littered the great hall, glittering like frozen blood under the lamps. Staff whispered in corners, as if the walls might still be listening. Clarissa sat in one of the velvet chairs, her hands trembling in her lap. She wasn't crying anymore. She just looked hollowed out, as if part of her had been buried with Eleanor in those shards. I stood near the window, watching the last of the police cars pull away. Harold Vale lingered in the doorway, his eyes red but dry, his jaw clenched tight. He hadn't been arrested. Not yet, but the look on his face said he knew his world had shattered as thoroughly as the mirror. For a man who had been the trustee of a fortune, losing everything in one night left him stripped down to bare nerves. "You should go home," I told Clarissa gently. Get some rest. Wolfe doesn't let his clients fall, and now that Dreslow's confessed, you're clear." Her voice was soft, hoarse. "I'm not clear, Mr. Goodwin. I'll never be clear. They'll always whisper that I wanted Eleanor gone, that I was the one who set this in motion. Dreslow may hang, but shadows don't die with him." I crouched beside her, lowering my voice. "People will talk, yes. That's what people do. But Wolfe gave you your freedom. It's up to you what you do with it now." She managed a small smile, fleeting but real. "You talk as if it's simple." "It never is," I said, "but it's better than swinging from a rope you didn't earn." When I escorted her to the waiting cab, she clutched my hand tightly as if afraid I'd disappear the second she let go. "Tell Mr. Wolfe I owe him everything," she whispered, "even if he doesn't care to hear it." I smiled. "He'll pretend not to, but he'll file it away. That's how he is." When the cab rolled off into the night, I returned to the mansion to close the loop with Harold. He hadn't moved, still standing in the doorway like a man waiting for a sentence. "You think this ends with Dreslow?" he said bitterly. "For you it does," I said. "Eleanor's gone. Clarissa inherits. The city will feed on your family name for weeks, maybe months, but you'll walk free. That's more than you deserve." He sneered. "And what will I live on? My reputation? That's gone. Dreslow may have burned the testament, but Wolfe burned me. Alive tonight." I didn't bother answering. Some ruins build themselves. Back at the brownstone, Wolfe was waiting. He hadn't moved from his chair, of course. The receiver still sat on the desk, as though the case had been handled by nothing more than the vibrations of his voice. Fritz had set out a late supper, cold meats, bread, and Wolfe's beer, gleaming gold in its glass. "Well?" Wolfe asked without opening his eyes. "Dreslow confessed," I said. "Kramer's got him. Clarissa's free. Harold's bitter but harmless. What about covering it?" Wolfe opened his eyes, heavy and deliberate. "Number that covers facts, not consequences." I frowned. "Meaning?" "Meaning," Wolfe said. "Eleanor Vale is still dead. Caldwell, the butler, is dead. Dreslow's motives explain their deaths, but they do not cleanse them. Clarissa will live with suspicion. Harold will live with humiliation. The estate will be torn apart by lawyers, and the public will gorge itself on scandal." "That's New York," I said. "It eats its rich alive and burps headlines." Wolfe's mouth curved, the faintest ghost of a smile. Crude, but accurate. I poured myself a drink and leaned against the desk. "You know, boss, you always say you act for truth, not gratitude. But Clarissa, she meant it. She thinks you saved her life." "I preserved the record," Wolfe corrected. "Her life was an incidental byproduct." I shook my head. "You really can't take a thank you, can you?" Wolfe closed his eyes again. "Gratitude clouds judgment. Truth requires clarity." The brass clock ticked on his desk, steady as always. 5 minutes of conversation had once again unraveled lies that could have buried an innocent woman. 5 minutes of Wolfe's mind against the chaos of greed, vanity, and fear. Later that night, as Fritz cleared the plates and Wolfe drifted into his orchid schedule, I sat alone at the typewriter. My notes clattered onto the page, each word stitching the case closed. I wrote of Eleanor's mirrors, of Clarissa's trembling, of Harold's bitterness, of Dreslow's downfall. I wrote it all because Wolfe demanded the record be whole, even when the people in it were broken. When I finished, I sat back, staring at the brass clock. The hands moved forward, steady and sure, and I thought of Eleanor Vale. They'd called her the mirror heiress, but mirrors only reflect what's in front of them. What killed her was what hid behind. The greed, the betrayal, the hunger for control. And Wolfe, as always, had dragged it into the open, piece by piece, until no one could look away. It was over. At least until the next ring of the phone. If there's one thing I've learned working for Wolfe, it's that finished never means what it should. By the time I'd filed my notes, poured myself a drink, and sat back with the satisfaction of a man who's dodged one more bullet, Wolfe had already shifted into his usual state of post-case silence. He called it repose. I called it brooding. Either way, the brownstone was quiet, except for the hum of Fritz in the kitchen and the faint tick of that brass clock. I was halfway through my glass when the doorbell rang. Fritz answered and shuffled George Hammett, Eleanor Vale's solicitor's clerk. A nervous little man, all elbows and apologetic coughs, he carried a leather satchel that looked far too heavy for his frame. Fritz led him in, and I could tell before he opened his mouth that he was here to ruin Wolfe's sense of repose. "Mr. Goodwin, Mr. Wolfe," Hammett said, wringing his hat. I shouldn't be here at all, but something's not right." Wolfe's eyes opened slowly. "Explain." Hammett opened the satchel and pulled out a folder stuffed with papers. These were duplicates, carbon copies of correspondence between Eleanor Vale and her lawyer, Dresslow. They dated weeks before her death. She mentions changing her testament, yes, but there's more. She wrote of being watched, of fearing someone in her house, and in one letter she warned that if anything happened to her, Clarissa was to be protected. Clarissa again. Always Clarissa. Hammett pushed a particular sheet across the desk. I read it over Wolfe's shoulder. The handwriting was sharp, deliberate. "Harold grows impatient. Dresslow presses me daily, and the mirrors feel like eyes upon me. If I am struck down, it will not be by one alone." Words hung in the air like smoke. Wolfe's brows lowered. "Not one alone," he murmured. I said what he didn't. So maybe Dresslow wasn't the only architect. Hammett's face was pale. There's something else. These letters. They were not in the firm's files. I found them hidden in Caldwell's desk. The butler must have kept them." Wolfe's eyes sharpened. Then Caldwell was not merely a servant. He was a custodian of secrets. He died not simply for what he knew, but for what he possessed. The thought settled heavily between us. I leaned forward. So Dresslow killed Caldwell to silence him, yes. But what if Caldwell had more than letters? What if he had evidence, something Eleanor entrusted to him, that's still out there? Hammett swallowed. Then whoever feared that evidence may still be at large. That hit like a hammer. I thought of Morton, one of the board members who had slinked out the night before, and the way his eyes had darted every time Wolfe mentioned the testament. I thought of Harold, too proud to fade quietly. And I thought of Clarissa, who might have inherited more than money, maybe a target on her back. Wolfe closed his eyes again, but I could see the storm building behind them. "Archie," he said, "you will retrieve all effects from Caldwell's quarters. Every paper, every drawer. There is more to be uncovered. Hurry." "Hurry?" I said. "You mean leave this warm chair, step out into the drizzle, and paw through the butler's sock drawer?" "Yes," Wolfe said flatly. "The matter is not concluded." I sighed. "Every time, boss. Every time you say it's over, and then you hand me a shovel." Still I went. Caldwell's quarters were in the servants' wing of the Vale mansion, now quiet as a tomb. The police tape was still strung across the door, but I slipped through with a little persuasion for the officer left behind. Inside, the room smelled of polish and dust. Modest, but not bare. Caldwell had been meticulous. Drawers were arranged with military precision, shoes lined like soldiers, papers stacked neatly. I searched for an hour, finding nothing but order, until I slid back to the false bottom of a writing desk. Inside was a slim packet wrapped in oilcloth. I unwrapped it and found photographs, grainy but damning, of Harold Vale meeting in secret with Dresslow, and another of Morton, the board member, handing Dresslow an envelope. There were also 2 receipts, both in Caldwell's careful hand, recording payments made to secure silence. I tucked them away and returned to the brownstone. Wolfe listened uninterrupted as I laid the evidence on his desk. His lips pressed thin, his fingers steepled. Caldwell was meticulous, Wolfe said. He knew his life was in danger, so he preserved a record. These images expose more than Dreslow. They implicate others who sought to profit from Eleanor's fall. I whistled low. So Harold wasn't just angry. He was paying, and Morton wasn't just nervous. He was bankrolling Dreslow. Precisely, Wolfe said, which means this affair is not finished. It is merely deepened. Harold and Morton are not without suspicion. They are entangled, and I will not allow the entanglement to remain hidden. I sat back, rubbing my temple. Boss, you realize this means Kramer's going to blow a vein. He thought he was done. The city thinks it's done. And now you're about to open the floodgates all over again. Wolfe closed his eyes, settling back into his chair with the weight of inevitability. Truth is never convenient, Archie. Fetch Inspector Kramer. Tonight, the loose ends must be tied. The brass clock ticked louder in silence, marking the minutes. The case that was supposed to be over had just come alive again, and I had the sinking feeling that before Wolfe finished tying these threads, someone else would be cut loose, for good. By the time I returned from Caldwell's quarters with the photographs and receipts, the brownstone felt less like a sanctuary and more like a war room. Wolfe hadn't moved from his chair, but his eyes followed every word I spoke as I laid the evidence out across his desk. Fritz had gone upstairs to avoid the tension, and the orchids rustled faintly under the draught from the open window. Wolfe studied the grainy photographs, the careful notations in Caldwell's script, and finally the receipts. His eyes narrowed, the weight of inevitability settling in. Archie, he said at last, this proves what we suspected. Dreslow was not the sole architect. He was a craftsman employed by other men who sought to keep their hands clean. Harold Vale supplied rage. Morton supplied capital. Dreslow supplied execution. And Caldwell preserved the record of their alliance. I leaned back in my chair. So what you're saying is, the spider had more than one leg. Dreslow was just the one we cut off first. Crude but apt, Wolfe murmured. Now the others must be drawn out. As if on cue, the phone rang. I answered. It was Inspector Kramer, his voice already rising like a storm tide. Goodwin, tell Wolfe I'm not hauling myself back to his brownstone for another of his theatre pieces. Dreslow confessed. The case is closed. If he's got something new, he can bring it to me. I handed the receiver to Wolfe. His tone was calm, deliberate. Inspector, you may believe your task is concluded. It is not. Caldwell's hidden records prove complicity beyond Dreslow. Photographs of Harold and Morton, receipts of payments. Do you intend to release guilty men because one fool has confessed? There was silence on the line. Then Kramer's growl. Damn you, Wolfe. Every time. Fine. Tomorrow morning you'll have them. All of them. But if this turns out to be smoke, I'll burn you with it. Tomorrow, Wolfe repeated, and hung up. I raised an eyebrow. So we're staging another performance? Not performance, Wolfe corrected. Revelation. Tomorrow we close the second net. The next morning the brownstone filled again. Kramer arrived first, sour-faced and tired, flanked by Rowcliffe and 2 uniforms. Behind them came Harold Vale, stiff in his morning suit, his eyes bloodshot but still defiant. Morton arrived shortly after, quiet, polished, his every gesture smooth as glass. Clarissa was last, pale and reluctant, clearly terrified of another night of suspicion. Wolfe opened his eyes and gestured for silence. Inspector, you may begin by reading these aloud. He pointed to the packet of photographs and receipts. Kramer scowled but complied, holding the evidence high so all could see. He read Caldwell's notations, marked payments, names attached. Harold's jaw clenched. Morton's fingers twitched against the arm of his chair. Clarissa stared at them both, her breath quickening. "This," Wolfe said when Kramer finished, "is not the record of one man's crime. It is the ledger of conspiracy. Dresslow was the visible hand, but Caldwell's careful notes prove invisible. Harold, you feared disinheritance. Morton, you feared corporate collapse if Eleanor shifted control. Together, you supported Dresslow, feeding him motive and means. He acted for both of you. And when Caldwell threatened exposure, you let him die." Harold shot to his feet, shouting, "Lies! Dresslow acted alone. I never gave him orders." Wolfe's voice thundered back. "Yet you met with him in secret, as the photograph shows. Why, if not to direct him?" Morton spoke then, his voice silky smooth. "Circumstance, Wolfe. A photograph proves nothing. I met Dresslow often, yes, but for business. You cannot hang men in the shadows." Wolfe leaned forward, his voice low, iron heavy. "But shadows cast by fire betray their source. Dresslow confessed to killing. Caldwell's records prove he did not plan alone. The net tightens, gentlemen, and you are caught." Kramer barked, "Enough. Harold Vale, Lyle Morton, you are both arrested. You can shout your innocence downtown." The uniforms moved in. Harold fought, thrashing, his face purple with rage. Morton did not resist. He rose smoothly, adjusted his cuff, and said only, "This is temporary. Men like me do not fall for long." As they were led out, Clarissa sagged in her chair, tears rolling silently down her cheeks. She whispered, "It's really over." "For you, yes," Wolfe said. "For them, not yet. The law will have its say. But the truth at least has been spoken." Kramer glared at Wolfe, cigar clenched. "You know, one of these days, I'm going to solve one without you. Just once." Wolfe closed his eyes. It would be a novelty. Kramer growled and stomped, dragging the culprit with him. The room emptied, leaving only Clarissa. She rose slowly, walked to Wolfe's desk and set down a small silver compact, her hand trembling. "For you," she said softly. "Eleanor wanted me to give you something of hers if she died. She said you valued truth more than anyone." Wolfe opened his eyes, stared at the compact, and inclined his head once. Then she was perceptive. Clarissa left, her footsteps fading into the city beyond. The brownstone fell silent again. Wolfe leaned back, closing his eyes again. "The second net is tied, Archie. We are finished." I lit a cigarette and stared at the brass clock. Finished, sure, until the next ring of the phone. If Wolfe thought the second net had tied the last knot, I knew better. Cases like this don't end with a neat bow. They end with ragged edges. Caldwell's cash had ripped the scheme wide open, dragging Harold and Morton down with Dresslow. But there was still something unsettled in the air. You could feel it in the brownstone that night, heavy as humidity before a storm. Fritz kept the lamps burning lower than usual, as though trying to soften the tension. Wolfe sat deep in his chair, his eyes shut, breathing steadily. But his fingers tapped against the armrest in tiny movements that told me his mind wasn't sleeping. He called it repose. I called it grinding gears. I was at my desk, filing away the photographs and receipts into Wolfe's meticulous system when the phone rang again. This time, it wasn't a client, a witness, or Kramer. The voice was low, distorted, deliberate. "Goodwin, you and Wolfe have gone too far. Morton won't stand trial. He has friends. He has reached. If you think dragging his name through the mud ends it, you're mistaken. You'll be buried in it." Then the line went dead. I set the receiver down slowly, feeling the chill creep through my gut. "Boss," I said, "that was no crank. Morton's got someone still running errands for him." Wolfe opened his eyes. "Of course. Men like Morton do not live in isolation. He has allies, associates and parasites who depend on his wealth, and parasites bite when their host is wounded. I poured myself a stiff drink. Sounds like we're next on the menu. We didn't have to wait long. Around midnight, Fritz went to lock the front door and he found the latch already broken, hanging loose. I moved fast, pulling him back as a shadow crossed the hall. The intruder stepped forward, a man in dark clothes, his hand tucked inside his coat. "Goodwin," he said, voice flat. "This is a message. Drop Morton. Drop the case, or you'll bleed like the butler did." I lunged before he could draw. The two of us slammed into the wall, his pistol clattering across the floor. He was wiry, fast, but fear makes a man sloppy. I drove a fist into his gut, then pinned him with my knee until Wolfe's voice thundered from behind me. "Enough!" The man froze. Wolfe didn't rise from his chair, but his eyes burned across the room like twin searchlights. "You have been sent by Morton's allies. Speak." The man struggled under my grasp. "I was paid to scare you off, that's all. Morton's people. He still controls accounts, property. They said Wolfe would fold if Goodwin bled. That's all." Wolfe's lip curled. Fools. Did they believe threats could dislodge the truth? Kramer arrived 20 minutes later, roused by my urgent call. He stormed in, red-faced from sleep, and stared down at the intruder cuffed on the floor. "For God's sake, Wolfe, can't you keep trouble inside one day without dragging me out of bed?" "Inspector," Wolfe said coolly, "this man is an emissary of Morton's circle. Proof that the conspiracy is wider than you cared to see." Kramer grumbled, but the evidence spoke for itself. The man had a revolver, Morton's monogrammed cufflinks in his pocket, and a slip of paper with Clarissa's address scrawled across it. When Clarissa's name appeared, Wolfe's voice dropped lower. "Archie, you will telephone Miss Rowan immediately. She must be moved from her residence at once. She remains a target until Morton's reach is severed." I made the call, my hand tight around the receiver. Clarissa answered, her voice faint with exhaustion. I told her to stay inside, lock her doors, and wait for a police escort. She sounded frightened, but steady. She trusted Wolfe, even from afar. By dawn, the intruder had been hauled away, but the air in the brownstone was still tense. Wolfe hadn't closed his eyes once, his gaze fixed on the evidence spread across his desk. The brass clock ticked steadily, marking out the hours like a drumbeat of warning. "Boss," I said finally, breaking the silence. "We've got Morton in custody, Dreslow nailed, Harold finished. Why are we still the targets?" "Because, Archie," Wolfe said, "truth is not enough for men like Morton. They fear exposure more than prison. Their power lies in illusion, mirrors, if you will. And when those mirrors shatter, they strike at the one who held the hammer." I lit a cigarette, the smoke curling in the dim light. "So we just wait for the next shadow to come through the door?" Wolfe closed his eyes. "Number, we will spring our own shadow. This afternoon, Kramer will bring me Morton. Here, in this office. We will cut off his last hope of escape, and when his allies see him broken, the strikes will end." I shook my head. "You know, one of these days your love of sitting in that chair is going to get us both shot." "Archie," Wolfe murmured, "my chair is impregnable. Your reflexes, however, remain essential." The last strike had come, but the final blow hadn't yet been dealt. Wolfe was preparing his trap, one last tightening of the net, and I had the creeping sense that this time the brownstone itself would be the stage for the mirror heiress's unfinished testament. By the time the sun pushed its grey light across West 35th Street, the brownstone had the feel of a stage set before the curtain rises. Wolfe hadn't moved from his chair all night, though Fritz brought him breakfast, and I swore he never touched it. His eyes stayed closed, but the weight in the room told me his mind was sharper than any blade. I kept pacing, watching the door, half expecting another intruder to slip through. The brass clock ticked on, loud as a drum beat, reminding us both that time was the one thing Morton was running out of. At 11 sharp, the sound of heavy footsteps filled the hall. Kramer arrived, his coat unbuttoned, his jaw working a cigar to death. Behind him, 2 uniforms marched Morton in, his cuffs gleaming in the morning light. He still had that smooth composure, that polished calm, as though the charges against him were a minor inconvenience to be corrected by lawyers. "Wolfe," Kramer growled, "here's your man. Don't tell me you dragged me down here just to watch you gloat." Wolfe opened his eyes, steady as stone. "No, Inspector. You're here to watch the man's last illusions shatter." Morton's lips curved in a smile that never reached his eyes. "You're thorough, Wolfe. I'll give you that. But you can't prove intent." Dreslow confessed. Vale raged himself into suspicion. "I'm nothing more than collateral." Wolfe gestured toward me. I laid the photographs and receipts on the desk. Caldwell's cash, damning in its quiet precision. Wolfe's voice rumbled low. "Caldwell preserved your conspiracy, Morton. Meetings with Dreslow, envelopes exchanged, payments recorded. Harold was furious, Dreslow was executed, but you were the architect. Even now your allies attempt violence to protect you. You're guilty not only of Eleanor's death, but of every strike that followed." Kramer slapped the photos with the back of his hand. "He's right, Morton. These tie you to it as clear as day. And the thug we caught last night, he carried your cufflinks. You've been sloppy." For the first time, Morton's composure cracked. His jaw tightened, his hands flexing against the cuffs. "Caldwell," he spat. "That servant ruined everything. He thought himself clever, hiding notes like a schoolboy. If I'd known—" "You would have killed him sooner," Wolfe finished. "Precisely." The silence was thick. Even Kramer froze, cigar halfway to his mouth. Morton's slip was enough to burn him twice. He knew it, and for a moment, as his smooth veneer collapsed entirely. Clarissa arrived then, escorted by Rowcliffe. She looked small in the doorway, but her eyes were steady. Wolfe turned toward her. "Miss Rowan, you may hear the truth spoken from the man's own lips. The testament your cousin intended for you was destroyed because of his fear. He engineered her death and the death of Caldwell to secure what he thought was his future. Do you wish to say anything?" Clarissa's voice shook but held firm. "You didn't just kill Eleanor. You destroyed our family. You turned every mirror in that house into a weapon. I hope you spend the rest of your life staring at your reflection and hating what you see." Morton sneered, but the fight had drained from him. The uniforms hauled him back to his feet. Wolfe leaned forward, his words heavy and final. "Inspector, you have your architect. There will be no more shadows, no more allies, no more strikes. The conspiracy has collapsed. The record is whole." Kramer exhaled smoke, shaking his head. "Damn you, Wolfe. You tie a bow on it like it's neat, but all I see is a graveyard." Wolfe's eyes closed again. "Truth is rarely neat, Inspector. But it is final." The room emptied. Kramer and his men dragging Morton, Clarissa leaving with quiet dignity. Fritz cleared the remains of Wolfe's untouched breakfast, the scent of coffee still lingering in the air. I stood by the desk, staring at the brass clock. Its hands moved steadily, unbothered, as though none of this had happened. I thought of Eleanor Vale, the so-called mirror heiress, and how her death had cracked open more than glass. Greed, ambition, fear, they had all been reflected back on her family until nothing remained but ruin. I lit a cigarette and turned to Wolfe. "So that's it. Morton's finished. Clarissa inherits. Kramer gets his arrests. You get your truth. Everyone's satisfied, except the dead." Wolfe's lips curved faintly, not into a smile but into something colder. "Satisfaction is for the living, Archie. The dead require only accuracy." I let the smoke curl up toward the ceiling, listening to the steady tick of the clock. Another case settled, another testament of greed written in blood. And once again, Wolfe had torn the mask from the guilty without leaving his chair. Settling the score never brought peace, but it was the closest thing we had. Until the phone rang again. When the door closed behind Kramer and his men, dragging Morton down into the city's iron belly, the brownstone seemed to exhale. The storm had broken, but the air still smelled of smoke. Wolfe remained in his chair, eyes closed, lips pressed together as if tasting the last trace of bitterness from the case. Fritz moved silently around the room, clearing the table where breakfast had grown cold. I sat at my desk, the brass clock ticking steadily between us, and let the silence weigh itself out. It was Clarissa's face that lingered with me. The way she'd stood in the doorway, trembling but resolute, facing Morton like a shadow that had haunted her whole life. Her words had more power than she knew. But strength doesn't erase suspicion. People would whisper in clubs and parlors, spinning tales about the mirror heiress, who never lived to sign her testament, and the cousin who profited by chance. Clarissa would bear that weight forever. And I wondered if Wolfe ever thought about how his clean records left the living to carry scars. Finally, Wolfe stirred. His eyes opened, slow and deliberate. "Archie," he said, "type." I rolled a fresh sheet into the machine. The keys clattered as Wolfe dictated in his measured baritone. The conspiracy surrounding the Vale estate was devised by Lyle Morton, executed by Dreslow, and facilitated by Harold Vale. Caldwell preserved the proof at the cost of his life. Eleanor Vale, intending to change her testament, died by their design. Clarissa Rowan was exonerated. The record is whole. I finished the line, ripped the page free, and set it on his desk. He read it once, nodded, and placed it beneath the others. Another case filed, another knot cut clean. I leaned back, lighting a cigarette. That's it? After all that blood and broken glass, just a paragraph to tie it up? Accuracy requires brevity, Wolfe said. The world may wallow in scandal. We preserve the truth. I exhaled smoke toward the ceiling. Truth doesn't comfort the living, boss. Clarissa's going to wake every night hearing mirrors shatter. Harold will rot in bitterness. Morton will fight any lawyer he can. Accuracy won't fix them. Nothing will fix them, Wolfe said. But clarity will keep others from inventing lies. That is enough. The brass clock ticked, steady and unyielding. Fritz returned, carrying Wolfe's beer on a silver tray. Wolfe lifted it, sipped, and closed his eyes as though the case had finally dissolved from his palate. I sat in the quiet, listening to the city beyond the windows, the horns, the footsteps, the endless churn. New York doesn't pause for justice. It digests it and asks for more. The phone rang once, sharp and insistent. Wolfe ignored it. I answered. It was Clarissa. Her voice was soft, hesitant. "Mr. Goodwin, tell Mr. Wolfe I'm grateful. He saved me." I glanced at Wolfe. His eyes were still closed, his lips unmoved. "He heard you," I said gently. "He just doesn't admit it." "Then tell him this," she whispered. "Eleanor always said mirrors show what we want to see. He showed the truth instead. That matters more than any inheritance." She hung up before I could answer. I set the receiver down, letting the words hang in the air. Wolfe said nothing, but I noticed the faintest curve at the corner of his mouth. Not a smile, just an acknowledgement. I typed a final line in my notes. The testament of the mirror. Heiress ended not with wealth, but with truth. And truth, in Wolfe's house, is always the last inheritance. I turned off the lamp, the office falling into shadow. The brass clock ticked on, patient as eternity. Wolfe leaned back in his chair, beer in hand, orchids waiting upstairs. I lit another cigarette, staring at the phone. Because in this city, the next call is always 5 minutes away.